Well, to begin, Robin and Polly, please can you introduce yourselves to the Why Read Me audience?
I'll go first, I guess. First, Callum, thank you for having us on the show. I'm Robin Waterfield. I've written quite a number of books which range from children's fiction to ancient Greek philosophy, so quite a wide range. But I'm perhaps best known as a translator. I've translated over, well, actually, I think it's getting on for 35 volumes of ancient Greek translations, almost entirely prose. I'm not a poet, and I really think translating poetry should be left to poets. Well, and they have to have competence in the languages, of course. But so I have translated mainly philosophers and historians who constitute the bulk of ancient Greek prose writing. That's me.
I'm Polly Low. I'm a professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University, and I work on classical Greek history and epigraphy and historiography, including Thucydides. So it was a great pleasure to be asked to work with Robin on this project.
Yes, and this project, I have it with me. It's a mighty book. I love the hardback. And to begin to introduce this work, the history of the Peloponnesian War, first could we introduce Thucydides? Who is Thucydides?
Who should take that? You or me, Robin? Who's it?
Polly, if you want to start, Robin can come on the back of it, maybe.
Okay, so Thucydides was an Athenian. We know that because he tells us that. Maybe actually to go back a bit, it's worth saying that the only things we really know about Thucydides for sure is stuff that he tells us in his work, and he doesn't tell us a lot about himself. But he tells us he was an Athenian. He tells us he lived through the war and was actually served as a general with not a huge amount of success, so fought briefly in the war. We assume that we know that he lived to see the end of the war, but it's generally thought that he died very shortly after the end of the war, so towards the end of the 5th century or start of the 4th century BCE. And we infer that he is sort of from the upper classes of Athenian society, that is relatively wealthy. His family has interest in gold mining, and in the fact that he served as a general is another sign that he was sort of moving among the elite of Athens, because that's one of the few offices in democratic Athens that you have to be elected to, rather than that you get out of by coming out of a lottery. And in order to stand for election, you probably have to have a certain amount of resource and contacts and so on. So we put him in the sort of top or upper stratum of Athenian society.
I think I want to elaborate a little bit. I think he was actually a pretty incompetent general. The passage where he describes his failure to save Amphipolis from the Spartans is, I think, an exercise in obfuscation and a little bit of self-excuse. So instead of concentrating on the fact that he failed to relieve Amphipolis, he said, "Yeah, but look, but I saved Aeon," you know. And also, I mean, you've got to consider the fact that Athens lost quite a number of generals during the war, even one to suicide. And they must have been, in need of competent generals. But Thucydides was exiled for 20 years. That only represents that's a severe punishment. It only represents the importance that the Athenians placed on Amphipolis. But he was never recalled. It was quite possible for people to be recalled from exile. So again, I think he just wasn't a very good general. I'm just teasing a little bit out of the text.
And the subject matter of his great work, the Peloponnesian War. What is the Peloponnesian War, and when does it take place?
So it's a war between Athens and Athens' allies or subjects. Athens is leading an organization that we call an empire, so sort of non-voluntary alliance by this point. So Athens and its allies on one side, and Sparta and its allies. Sparta also leads an alliance, but it's a slightly less coercive alliance called the Peloponnesian League on the other side. So sort of two major power blocks in classical Greece. It breaks out in the late 430s BCE, and it runs, well, Thucydides says it is a single war which runs until 4043, although it is a war which, even in Thucydides' narrative, is very clearly made up of at least two distinct stages with a break in, or sort of a break in the middle. So actually one thing that, I mean, Thucydides is very insistent on the fact that this is one continuous war, but that in itself is quite a big clue that not everybody thought that this was the case, that other people might have seen it as more of a sequence of related conflicts. And in fact, this isn't the first conflict between Athens and Sparta that's happened in the 5th century. There's been an earlier conflict, sometimes called the First Peloponnesian War, that's happened in the middle of the century as well. So it's the idea of calling it the Peloponnesian War is, well, it's Thucydides' idea, that he's persuaded most of history that he was right to do that. But it's an ongoing sequence of conflicts between Athens and Sparta.
And the differences between Athens and Sparta, is it simply democracy versus oligarchy, or are some of these differences maybe more of a construct in that sense?
Oh, yes. So I think you're right to sort of draw our attention to the fact that there's sort of constructedness in the polarity between Athens and Sparta. They have very different political systems. Democratic in Athens, broadly oligarchic in Sparta, although the Spartan constitution is a complicated thing. They're ethnically different. So the Athenians are Ionian. Most but not all of the Athenian allies are Ionian. Most but not all of the Spartan allies are Dorian. Thucydides doesn't think that that's a significant distinction. But again, this is one of these cases where I think we can see the fact that Thucydides spends so much time telling us that this isn't important probably means that lots of other people did think this was important. Thucydides makes a lot of the sort of ideological, cultural differences between the two sides, particularly the Athenians and the Spartans. The Athenians very sort of innovative, dynamic. The Spartans very small c, conservative. You could also see it as a sort of a power struggle driven by the question of who gets to be the leading state in the Greek world. Sparta has had that position earlier in the 5th century. Athens had taken it over. So you could see it more in terms of the sort of interstate dynamics rather than something driven by differences internal to the two communities.
Yes, and in terms of what makes the Peloponnesian War significant, in the introduction to the book, Polly, you write that the war was long and often brutal, but it did not dramatically change the course of history. And within a century of its conclusion, both the victor, Sparta, consistently called the Lacedaemons. That's a soft C, I hope. I hope I'm getting that right. I see a shake of the head. We'll leave it to interpretation. And the defeated Athens were well on their way to political irrelevance. Robin, maybe you could come in on this. Is it actually more the account of the conflict which takes on the importance rather than the physical fighting itself? Is that why we are aware of the Peloponnesian War?
I incline to that view. I mean, I incline to the view that the importance of the Peloponnesian War is that Thucydides wrote about it and wrote such a fantastically terrific book. But no, obviously it had its own importance, as Polly says. These were the two largest states in Greece, you know, battling it out to be alpha male. But going back to its Thucydides being that Thucydides wrote it up, what he's given us is an account which resonates through the ages in any war. was looking at some Amazon reviews today, and lots of people have said, "Oh, the parallels with our time are so obvious," and so on and so forth. So even if the war wasn't significant in itself, in the broader historical context, I think it revealed a lot of the. This was specifically Thucydides' intention. It reveals a lot of the factors that recur in human history time and again when war breaks out or nearly breaks out. So again, that's coming back to the point that I think the importance is that Thucydides wrote about it.
What is the correct pronunciation? Ask the experts.
Lacedaemonians.
Yes. Okay. And would Thucydides have received a peculiar reaction to choosing the Peloponnesian War as his subject matter?
No, they thought it was important. The Greeks thought it was important. So,
okay. And if we touch on the world of Thucydides, the introduction notes that Greece in Thucydides' time was not a single place or even a very clearly defined one. Obviously, now, in modernity, in modern Europe, we have a fixed idea of what Greece is. However, this is very much not the case when Thucydides is writing his account.
Yes, here's the short answer. The longer answer is, so there's the sort of the core political unit is the polis or city-state, of which there are perhaps 1,000 or so inhabited by people who thought of themselves as Greek, from the Western Mediterranean, so from Spain and particularly southern Italy, Sicily, right through to the Black Sea. So modern day Ukraine, that region, and including a lot in Western Anatolia, modern Turkey as well. So it's much bigger than the current borders of the modern nation state of Greece. And those city-states, Athens and Sparta, are atypical, which is a sort of a problem because they're the ones we know most about, but they're also probably the least usual city-states because they're both unusually big in terms of their territory and in terms of their population size. But even so, in compared to a modern nation-state, absolutely tiny. So Athens maybe 200,000 or so, including so the entire resident population, of whom probably only sort of 30 to 60,000 had citizen status. So the rest were women, children, enslaved people. So not very big at all. And most city-states were significantly smaller than that. So 1,000, maybe even just hundreds of people. So I know you have a Durham background, Callum, but my analogue for Athens, actually, Durham City is not a bad comparandum in sort of County Durham in terms of the size of both the territory and the population. So you're thinking in terms of sort of market towns rather than nations.
Yes. Going into Thucydides' writing here, Robin, when looking at the main causes for the conflict, Book 1, Section 23 seems to be a crucial passage detailing Thucydides' own description of the casus belli. He writes, "It was started by the Athenians and the Peloponnesians when they broke the treaty, the 30 years peace that they had entered into after the fall of Euboea." He continues, "In my opinion, the truest cause, even if it was never openly stated, was the growth of Athenian power, which frightened the Lacedaemonians." Robin, you say it?
Lacedaemonians.
Yes, and made them feel that they had to go to war. My selection of doing more Latin over Greek is coming out here. But yeah, is this in a nutshell what leads to the war? Simply that the Athenians have too much power. It is a inevitability in that sense of their growing influence in this world.
Well, I'll have to bring Polly in on this because she's the historian, but I think Thucydides is right. Yes, I think it was Spartan fear of Athenian growth, combined with the fact that they wanted to be top dog. Anything else, Polly?
Yeah, I mean it's it depends. I mean, as Thucydides also points out, it depends sort of what you want to count as the true cause, the most important cause, because I think something else that comes out very clearly in his longer section on the causes of the war is how multi-layered the causation of this war is, and you can look for sort of surface triggers, or you can look for the underlying reason. I suppose one thing about that explanation that makes it Spartan, not quite the Spartans' fault, but it gives Spartans almost the agency, that it was their fear that drove the war. And some people have seen that as maybe letting the Athenians off the hook too much, because we do one of the rare points where we have an alternative version of events from Thucydides is on the question of the origins of the war, and we can see from actually sort of unexpectedly from Aristophanes, comic poet, that there was another contemporary explanation circulating which really pinned the blame very specifically on Pericles, the leading Athenian politician, and on his policies, his aggressiveness, and possibly on his desire, and this might also be something that has contemporary resonance, to distract attention from a scandal of financial mismanagement, and in order to sort of get himself off the hook, he involved Athens in this war. So there were other explanations circulating in Athens in the 5th century about why this war broke out. I, like Robin, think the sort of this explanation based on power and fear is very, very compelling, but clearly other ways of thinking about it as well.
And just before this passage, Thucydides makes his bold kind of work for all time claim. I have seen the sentence previously translated as, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." Robin, you go for, "The work has been composed as a possession for all time rather than a virtuoso performance for a single hearing." What led you to this translation of, I guess, what has become quite an iconic line? And how was Thucydides able to predict his own impact and kind of literary immortality?
Well, he wasn't predicting it; he was hoping it.
Yeah.
It's a curious fact about ancient Greek literature in all its branches and other forms of artwork, and painters and so on. They had an intense rivalry. They were always sort of saying, "I've done better than so and so and so and so." So this is Thucydides preempting all of that by saying, "Well, I've done the best ever, so forget it." Why did I translate it that way? I can't remember. I can't remember why I chose that particular wording. It's the other version you read out seems equally accurate. It's just a question of different wording. I mean, whatever. For every single sentence and for every single book as a whole, I strive for clarity and readable modern English without obviously distorting either the wording or the sense, the meaning of the original, and the tone of the original. I mean, Thucydides' tone is very austere and magisterial, and so I was trying to. It's very. I've done a lot of translations, as I said, and it's very important for me that each of them doesn't read like Robin Waterfield. Each of them reads like Thucydides or Benjamin or Plutarch or whoever. And I'm not sure how well I do on that front, but I really did try to keep Thucydides' objectivity or pretend objectivity.
Would you say this has been your most challenging project as a translator? You note the complexity of Thucydides' Greek. I know previously when we discussed Place One, Why Read Me, obviously you've done more translations of philosophical works and things like that. Did you find that there was, I mean, obviously those are your aims that you've just declared there, but did you have to approach it or find it different to interpret? Was this your biggest challenge as a translator?
Next year, I've got a translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics coming out.
Okay.
I think in certain respects that was more of a challenge than Thucydides. But yeah, Thucydides' Greek can be very difficult. There are some passages which are delightful, that is, particularly when he's just giving a battle narrative or an army is moving from one place to another and so on. The Greek is very clear. But then when he goes into analysis and when he writes the speeches, which give us, as it were, some of the background thinking of what's going on, some of the reasoning, then the Greek can get very difficult. And so not just difficult, but so different from the way that English is written. But it's very important, I think, for a translator, and this is certainly something I did with Thucydides, to, he can write a sentence that lasts for 3/4 of a page. That just doesn't work in English. So as a translator, I've got to not just translate the Greek into the English, but I've got to transfer, which is the same word in Latin, I've got to transfer the idioms of one language and make them work in the idioms of another language. Difficult. But I've been doing it for a long time, so I think I'm getting better.
Yes. Were there any specific translations that you were consulting, or that you initially looked at as kind of the definitive translations that you wanted to use as a guide, say?
Yes, I always collect all the best. Actually, I failed on one. And when I did Marcus Aurelius, I didn't know that translation by a man called Gregory Hayes was so popular. I didn't even know of its existence. But generally speaking, yeah, I gather all the best translations, and I refer to them in the same way that I refer to dictionaries or thesauruses. I translate a sentence or a paragraph, and then I look at it and I tweak it, and I think I can do better than that. Is that quite the right word? Is that quite the right phrase? And then I might consult a thesaurus or another translation to trigger further ideas in me as to how to improve what I've done. So that's generally what I do. To name names, Jeremy Minor's translation of these is, I think, the one to beat. I don't think I've beaten him in terms of quality of translation. His is really very good, but mine's going to be cheaper. Practical matter that students will love, I hope.
Yeah, so flipping back to more of the context and the history, how does the Peloponnesian War come to an end, and what are its defining moments for you, Polly?
So the end, Thucydides doesn't narrate the end of the war. It comes to the end. We have to turn to Xenophon. His Hellenica narrates the last years of the war. It ends, the Athenians lose a big naval battle, which means ultimately they can no longer, they lose control of the sea, and that means they can't feed themselves. So they're starved into submission. Ultimately, is what happens, that they have to surrender because there's famine. So it sort of ends in some ways with a whimper rather than with a bang. In terms of significant events during the war, one of the really notable things actually about this war, and a big difference from the Greco-Persian War, is that it's very short on sort of big set piece battles, and that is, as Thucydides tells us at the start, that was part of the Spartans' plan, because they thought, or the Athenians' plan rather, that they thought if they tried to confront the Spartans in a pitch battle, they lose. So the Athenians avoid a pitch battle. So it's a long way into the war before we get a direct sort of old-fashioned hoplite encounter between Athenians and Spartans. So
the Athenians lose.
Yeah, so it proves that they were right to avoid doing this earlier on. So it's not a war which creates those set piece moments, but it has the significant moments are they're the opposite of a sort of glorious hoplite battle. So the first, what Thucydides says is the first event of the war, which is the night attack on Plataea, which is this incredible, amazingly described, extremely confusing, very sort of doesn't fit any of the rules, the conventions of what warfare is meant to be like, because it's a surprise attack. there are women involved. There are people who are throwing tiles off roofs, and then there's horrible sort of people getting burnt to death, and it's an extremely inglorious event, and that sort of in some way sets the tone for the rest of the war. What else would I pick out? Again, so I've just been in the northwestern edge of Greece, the very sort of complicated fighting led by the general Demosthenes, where the armies keep getting lost, sort of missing each other in the trees and in the valleys. The events in Sicily is a sort of a very extended and again hugely impressively constructed narrative of how this expedition, which was going to be so glorious and win things decisively for Athens, and how it just progressively goes wronger and wronger and ends in absolute disaster and despair. So yeah, those would be the things. If I had to sort of take excerpts from Thucydides to my desert island, those would probably be the bits. But there are lots of other things one could choose, but probably not any of the hoplite battles actually.
Yeah, it seems that the defining moments come through, you know, the written accounts of Thucydides, memorable moments of his written accounts, such as the funeral speech of Pericles, for example. I watched a lecture from Edith Hall on the oration, and it was dubbed "The Greatest Speech of All Time." What makes it so significant, so great? Robin, if you want to maybe comment on this as well, in terms of when you were working with the text, why has it taken on such significance, Pericles?
Yeah. Well, I'll just preface by saying I worked at this extremely hard because I knew my translation was going to be judged on this speech more than anything else. So I tried really hard to get that right. It's a magnificent piece of rhetoric. It's a magnificent. One of the odd things about late 5th century Athens is that although we get some people developing a kind of a philosophy of oligarchy, we get nobody doing the same for democracy. Again, rather parallel to what's happening in the States, where the Republicans have all the sort of voice and the Democrats are rather wimpish. So, and this, you know, or some parts of this speech are, in a sense, a manifesto for democracy, or at least for Athenian-style democracy. So it's important for that as well. I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I want to say about it.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was an ancient political thought and action, a module that I did when we were looking at it in terms of the development of a social contract between like the individual and the state and things like that. Yeah, it just seems to, the more and more you look at it, the more there is in the funeral oration, and it seems to be a strong moment of emotion and empathy within the text, which you don't necessarily get in more of the kind of literal descriptions.
Although it's also, I mean, it's quite bleak, like the bit at the end where he says, "Oh, if you're sad about your children being killed, don't worry, you can just have some more." I mean, this is sort of. I take the point about a social contract, but it's quite maybe not an equal contract between the state and its citizens. And then the other thing that this is a point made by Tony Woodman, I think, a long time ago, that the placement of that speech is so striking and must be deliberate because it comes right before another really memorable set piece, which is the account of the plague. So you have this vision of Athens, you know, the best Athens that there could be, articulated in the funeral oration of Athens as this, it's a place where citizens are committed to the state and the state will do things for the citizens. And then you have this description of a city that's really just is falling apart, and it's every man for himself, and people are stealing other people's graves, and you know everything's going wrong. So sort of how you read that speech against that description of the plague is another challenge that Thucydides gives to his readers, I think.
I'd be interested to touch on certain aspects of a philosophical aspect to Thucydides' work in terms of him, as a sophist, in the relationship between nature and convention, which there seems to be elements which are touched on in the text.
Yes, you're right, but no, I can't really address that. It's a topic I've always meant, I mean, for 50 years to develop more of the influences of 5th century intellectual thought on Thucydides, but I never have done. So everybody says it's there, so I believe them.
Yeah, and sort of, I think one question, again, I'm not the best qualified to talk about it, but it's a question of how, I think Thucydides definitely is aware of these debates, these intellectual currents, and is engaging with them, or is in that environment.
Yeah. But
whether he's endorsing them or whether what he's actually trying to do is show that these are very dangerous ideas or wrong-headed ideas. So the speech of Cleon in the Mytilene debate, which has lots of sort of, well, it's criticism of rhetoric and rhetorical tricks, and sort of telling the Athenians off for being so susceptible to these newfangled ideas. But it's also a speech which makes a lot of use of these techniques. So Thucydides never, in so many words, says he thinks that sophists are dangerous people, or that sophistic thought is a dangerous thing. But he's sort of playing with these ideas, and maybe inviting a reader to think, is there something quite worrying about these, at least some of these rhetorical techniques, and maybe some of the philosophical ideas that underpin them, because the concept that there's the laws that keep a society together are just convention, and we could scrap all of that and just go by human nature. Well, what happens when we do that? Is that things necessarily going to turn out very well if we get rid of the conventions that hold our society together? It seems to me that that's one of the things that the text might be encouraging to worry about.
Yeah.
How much of an insight do you think we can get into the personal beliefs of Thucydides through the Peloponnesian War? And I am aware that there can be a certain degree of hesitancy in ascribing the views of the author to something that is said by someone else. So, a lot of politicians, I feel, they like to go for the kind of the might is always right in Thucydides. And when the Athenians at Milos, they argue, what nature demands is that the strong do what they can and the weak concede them that right. Is this to be taken as Thucydides? Is this to be taken as simply the voice of an actor in the war? Or is the answer somewhere in between?
I think you have to be rightly very, very careful when it's Pericles or Cleon or somebody else speaking. But nevertheless, I think it is possible to, if you leave the speeches aside, to do some aspect. But it's always difficult. I mean, the most notorious example is his views on religion. Whereas his predecessor, Herodotus, had ascribed events to the works of the gods, Thucydides avoids that. He either ignores the gods, or in one or two cases actually repudiates the idea that this was something to do with divine intervention. But you see, it's left ambiguous, because going back to that chapter, book 1, chapter 23, section 23, I mean, among the pathermata, among the suffering that the Greeks endured, he says, during this war, were a number of events such as eclipses, earthquakes, I can't remember what else, but those things which absolutely traditionally are ascribed to the gods. So here he is ascribing some of the pathermata that the Greeks suffered to the gods, whereas else, so it's difficult.
Polly, would you have anything to follow up on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really hard to reconstruct his views. I mean, likewise on politics, he does at one point give us an explicit statement on the constitution that he thought was a good constitution, which is the sort of moderate democracy after the failed oligarchic coup in 411, and then the democracy is restored, but with sort of safeguards on it, so we can maybe get some way in reconstructing his political views, that he was not a fan of a radical democracy, but also not a full-blown oligarch. But other than that, yeah, it's very elusive. He's not an author who's very present in his text. Another difference from Herodotus, who's sort of there quite a lot.
Yeah.
Quite elusive. But I think that's why we keep reading it, because if he just told us what he thought and what he wanted us to think, then then you just read it once and then you don't need to go back to it. But it's a much more interesting text because it's so in some weird ways quite open.
I mean, as Polly says, Thucydides expresses admiration for this moderate democracy. It's sort of both at once in 411. But then he expresses enormous admiration for Pericles. It gives him a glowing obituary. And Pericles was not a moderate Democrat. He was a radical Democrat. So again, as Polly says, it's difficult to really pin him down. And he also says it.
We touched on the work being unfinished. To what extent is it unfinished? I mean, even if we look at book 8, the last book, is this incomplete? Is it simply as Thucydides died before he was able to actually complete this great work?
I am one of those who think book 8 is incomplete. The reason for thinking it incomplete is that you get no speeches. Well, the main reasons is you get no speeches in direct speech. You only get them in reported speech, and also his treatment of treaties between people is different from elsewhere in the book. But okay, so and it's easy to say this about book 8 because it's the last book, and that takes us up to 411, and then the rest of the war is lost. But he does something to book 5 as well, in terms of not directly reporting speeches. So, and there's another bit. Very, very curious bit. Getting page after page after page of solid prose, and then suddenly at one point in the book, there's a little bit of short dialogue. What I'm trying to get at here is that he was perhaps a bit of an experimenter in how he wrote. So, although I happen to believe that the book 8 is unfinished, maybe it's not. Maybe he was simply experimenting with a different way of presenting the material of treaties and the substance of speeches.
Polly, do you believe book 8 is also unfinished, or?
I'm more convinced the book 8 is unfinished, particularly because it doesn't quite end halfway through a sentence, but there's the beginning, sort of first he did this sentence, which we would expect to sort of, and then he did that, but that bit never comes. And I mean, there are references in earlier books which lead the reader to expect that we are going to get a more detailed narration of the last years of the war, which could of course be a clever subterfuge in the way that, I'm sure you never did this, but sometimes in the olden days of handwritten exams, students would write an introduction or refer to the second answer book to which didn't exist, to lead the marker to think that there was a whole extra bit which was going to come, which they'd never written. So I could say it's
I've never heard of that before.
It's continued in answer booklet 2. It didn't exist. But yeah, I think there's some things that do really look like another round of revision was going to happen. So yeah, the absence of direct speeches in book 8 and book 5, the verbatim reported treaties. But beyond that, there are inconsistencies in the work. There are things where his explanations in one book aren't quite compatible with what he says later on, and some commentators think, well, if there'd been a further round of revision, that would all have been smoothed out, and it would have become a much more sort of neat and tidy work. But I'm less sure about that because, as Robin says, this is quite an experimental work as well in some ways, and we probably shouldn't expect it to be nice and tidy. The thing I'd really like to know is whether there was originally intended to be much more Persia in the book as a whole, because that's one of the really striking gaps. And if Thucydides intended to write a book 9 and a book 10, is that where we would have got what Thucydides thought the Persian Empire was doing, which is really just not there in any significant way in the work as we have it.
Right. I think he'd have had to, because as what I said earlier, I mean, the Spartans won essentially because they were getting financed by the Persians, so they could actually attack the Athenian Empire directly with a fleet. So he would have had to have covered the Persians. Whether he would have given us a nice section where he retrospectively went back and filled in the gaps about Athenian relationships with Persians, which he failed to tell us about, is another matter. Perhaps he would. I'd like to think he would.
Yeah, are there any theories as to why there might have been a reason why Persia is omitted if it wasn't for leaving it for the end section, which he was not able to complete? Would there be any reason why this would be a conscious decision?
Maybe to differentiate himself from Herodotus, which he seems to be keen to do in various ways. Herodotus has done Persia very thoroughly and in a very distinctive way. And so one hypothesis is that Thucydides is deliberately not going to cover the same ground as Herodotus, so he's going to not do Persia because he's not Herodotus.
As we touched on at the beginning, the players and actors of the Peloponnesian War, at the time, I suppose they did not know that they were taking part in this grander, more established conflict when they're fighting these localized battles. Trying to make a reflection of our own times. I mean, I was wondering when looking at this, are we experiencing something similar at the moment in the modern world? How do you think Thucydides would have perceived and documented our current times? Polly, you write that in dark times, there can be something appealing in a text that is willing to confront the realities of human behavior head on. I just wonder if we can make a link there.
It's hard. I find this hard to do without sort of projecting my own feelings onto Thucydides. So this answer would say more about me than about Thucydides. But I mean, what I find now these days when I sort of think about Thucydides, about this period of history, is the power of the individual and the way that one or two individuals can have just a transformative effect on the world. And that is there in Thucydides. There are powerful individuals who, for good or ill, shape the course of the war that he's writing about. So I think it would have been interesting. I'm not sure if he would be interested, but I would be interested to know what Thucydides would have done with those phenomena in our own times.
And finally, Robin, this is your second time on the show. Polly, this is your first. Are there any future projects in the pipeline? Robin, you mentioned the Nicomachean Ethics as your next one.
That's coming out later this year. I said next year before. That was wrong. It's coming out later this year. And then I've got Xenophon Selenica the year after that. And that, I don't know, might be my last book. I don't know.
Yeah. Like Xenophon, who got to the end of the Hellenica and said, "That's it."
Yeah. Someone else can take over from here. No, there is one more. I've translated all the major Greek historians now, except for one. So I am tempted to do that, and that would be Arians and Epictetus.
And from translating all the major Greek historians, what is it that you think makes Thucydides different and, dare I say, so special in that aspect?
His tone, his magisterial, clear tone. He's never going to descend to what historiographers call tragic history or anything like that. No chance at all. He's just absolutely trying to give you the facts. His truth is close to what we think of as objective truth, rather than the truth of some other historians, which is more to do with weaving a story and things like that. No, I'm not dissing the other historians. I love Polybius, I love Herodotus, everybody in their own way.
Perfect. Well, I hope we can do this again when Nicomachean Ethics is translated. I very much look forward to that. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Robin and Polly. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, man.
Yes.